Lieutenant Sarah Chun had been assigned to the diplomatic station orbiting Kepler 442b for 3 months when the Zephyrians made their first formal contact. The massive alien vessel, shaped like a crystalline spear, dwarfed the human research station. Sarah watched through the observation deck as shuttlecraft emerged from the alien ship, their hulls gleaming with an otherworldly blue-white luminescence. The briefing had been simple enough. The Zephyrians were an advanced species, possibly thousands of years ahead of humanity in technology. They had observed human expansion into space for decades before finally deciding to make contact. The diplomatic team was to establish peaceful relations and hopefully learn from their advanced civilization. Sarah's role was straightforward. She was part of the security detail, trained in xenobiology and first contact protocols. She was supposed to observe, protect the diplomats, and stay quiet. Nothing had prepared her for what walked off that shuttle. The Zephyrian delegation consisted of 3 beings, each standing nearly 7 feet tall. Their bodies were humanoid, but covered in what appeared to be living armor, scales that shifted color from deep purple to silver, depending on the light. Their faces were angular, with large eyes that held an intelligence that seemed to pierce through everything they looked at. The delegation leader, who identified herself as Commander Thyra, carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority. The initial meeting took place in the station's main conference room, a sterile white space designed to be culturally neutral. Ambassador Martinez led the human delegation, flanked by Dr. Reeves, the xenobiologist, and Captain Morrison, the station commander. Sarah stood at attention near the back wall with the other security personnel, trying to blend into the background. The conversation began with formal pleasantries. The Zephyrians spoke in perfect English, their voices carrying harmonics that made the words sound almost musical. They explained that their species had been monitoring human development for centuries, watching as humanity spread across their solar system and began reaching for the stars. "We have observed your species with great interest," Commander Thyra said, her large eyes fixed on Ambassador Martinez. "Humans possess certain qualities that are unusual among the civilized species we have encountered." Ambassador Martinez leaned forward. "What qualities would those be, Commander?" "Emotional volatility," Thyra replied without hesitation. "Most advanced species learn to suppress their emotional responses as they develop technologically. Emotions lead to unpredictable behavior, which leads to conflict and inefficiency. Your species has reached spaceflight while retaining full emotional capacity. This is unprecedented." Dr. Reeves interjected. "Is that why you've decided to make contact now? To study our emotional responses?" Something shifted in Thyra's expression, a subtle change that Sarah, trained to read body language, immediately noticed. The alien scales darkened slightly, and her posture became more rigid. "We are here to evaluate whether humanity poses a threat to galactic stability," Thyra said. "Emotional species tend to be aggressive, unpredictable. However, your expansion has been remarkably restrained. You have shown caution, scientific curiosity, and what you call ethics in your approach to space exploration." The meeting continued for 2 hours, with both sides exchanging basic information about their respective civilizations. The Zephyrians revealed that they were part of something called the Galactic Consortium, an alliance of advanced species that maintained peace and stability across their region of space. Humanity's expansion had brought them to the edge of consortium space, necessitating this first contact. As the formal session concluded, Sarah noticed Commander Thyra's gaze had wandered from the diplomats to her. The alien's large eyes seemed to study her with an intensity that made Sarah uncomfortable. When Ambassador Martinez suggested a brief recess before continuing discussions, Thyra approached Sarah directly. "You are military," Thyra observed, her musical voice now carrying a note of curiosity. "But also something more. Your emotional emanations are complex." Sarah glanced at Captain Morrison, who gave her a slight nod. "Yes, Commander. I'm Lieutenant Chun, security detail. I'm also trained in xenobiology and cultural analysis." "Fascinating," Thyra said, stepping closer. "In my species, we have individuals who specialize in the study of primitive emotional responses. It is considered a dangerous field of study, as prolonged exposure to emotional thinking can corrupt our logical processes. Yet you combine emotional capacity with analytical thinking naturally. With respect, Commander, emotions aren't primitive, Sarah found herself saying before she could stop herself. They provide crucial information about our environment and help us make decisions that pure logic might miss. The room fell silent. Ambassador Martinez shot Sarah a warning look, but Thyra's expression shifted again. Her scales lightened, cycling through shades of blue and silver. "Explain," Thyra commanded. Sarah took a deep breath, aware that every eye in the room was on her. Emotions evolved as survival mechanisms. Fear keeps us alive in dangerous situations. Love and empathy bind us together in cooperative groups. Even anger can be useful. It motivates us to fight injustice or protect those we care about. Pure logic can tell you the most efficient solution, but emotions tell you whether that solution is right. Thyra was quiet for a long moment, her large eyes never leaving Sarah's face. When she spoke, her voice carried a strange quality that hadn't been there before. "Your species claims that emotions make you stronger, not weaker?" "I believe they do," Sarah replied. "They're not always easy to manage, and they can lead us astray sometimes. But they're also the source of our greatest achievements. Art, music, literature, scientific discoveries driven by curiosity rather than mere necessity. All of these come from our emotional nature." The alien commander's scales continued to shift, now displaying patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. In consortium space, such thinking is considered heretical, dangerous. We have laws against what you humans call emotional expression in public forums. Captain Morrison stepped forward. "Commander, if this is making you uncomfortable, we can." "No," Thyra said sharply, raising a hand that Sarah now noticed was more claw than finger. "This is exactly why we are here. To understand how a species can maintain emotional capacity and still achieve technological advancement. Your lieutenant has provided more insight in 5 minutes than our researchers have gathered in decades of distant observation." She turned back to Sarah. "You speak of emotions as if they are tools to be used rather than weaknesses to be overcome. This concept is alien to us." The irony of an alien calling human concepts alien wasn't lost on Sarah, but she kept her expression neutral. "Maybe that's because you've never had the chance to experience them safely. In your civilization, emotions might be dangerous because you've never learned to integrate them with rational thought." Thyra's scales shifted to deep purple, a color that Sarah was beginning to associate with intense concentration. "You believe we have made an error in our evolution?" "Not an error," Sarah said carefully. "Just a different choice. Both paths have their advantages and disadvantages." The meeting reconvened an hour later, but something had fundamentally changed. Commander Thyra's questions were no longer focused on humanity's potential threat level. Instead, she seemed fascinated by the emotional underpinnings of human decision-making. She asked about human art, about the role of love in human society, about how humans dealt with grief and loss. Ambassador Martinez tried to steer the conversation back to formal diplomatic topics, but Thyra seemed genuinely uninterested in trade agreements or territorial boundaries. Her focus remained on the human capacity for emotional experience. As the day's sessions concluded, Thyra approached Sarah again. "Lieutenant Shun, I would like to request an informal meeting with you tomorrow. There are aspects of your emotional framework that I find puzzling." Sarah looked to Captain Morrison, who seemed uncertain but nodded his approval. "Of course, Commander. I'm at your disposal." As the Zephyrian delegation returned to their shuttle, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted in the alien commander's demeanor. The way Thyra looked at her had changed throughout the day, from clinical interest to something that seemed almost personal. That night, as Sarah lay in her bunk reviewing the day's events, she wondered if she had said too much. Her training had emphasized the importance of maintaining diplomatic distance during first contact scenarios. But there had been something in Thyra's expression when she spoke about emotions being considered dangerous in consortium space, a flicker of what might have been longing or regret. Sarah stared at the ceiling of her quarters, watching the distant stars through the small porthole. Tomorrow's meeting would be different. She could sense it. More personal, more dangerous. The question was whether that danger came from revealing too much about humanity's emotional nature, or from the possibility that the Zephyrians had given up more than they realized when they chose logic over feeling. Outside her window, the alien ship hung in space like a crystal monument to advanced civilization. But, for the first time since it had arrived, Sarah found herself wondering if that advancement had come at a cost that no amount of technology could repay. The observation deck was nearly empty when Sarah arrived the next morning. She had chosen this location for their informal meeting because it offered the best view of both Earth's distant sun and the Zephyrian vessel. She wanted neutral ground, somewhere that belonged equally to both species and neither. Commander Thyra arrived precisely on time. But something about her appearance was different. Her living armor seemed less rigid, the scales displaying softer hues of blue and silver rather than the deep purples of formal occasions. Her movements were more fluid, less controlled. "Lieutenant Shun," Thyra said as she approached, "I appreciate you agreeing to this meeting." "Of course, Commander. Though I have to admit, I'm not sure exactly what you want to discuss." Thyra moved to stand beside her at the observation window, looking out at the stars. "Yesterday, you spoke of emotions as tools for survival and growth. This concept has troubled me throughout the night cycle." Sarah waited, sensing that Thyra was struggling with something fundamental. "In my species, we undergo a process called emotional ablation when we reach maturity," Thyra continued. "It is a surgical and psychological procedure that removes our capacity for what you would call feelings. We retain the ability to experience satisfaction at task completion and dissatisfaction at failure, as these are necessary for motivation. But love, fear, anger, joy, these are considered evolutionary remnants that interfere with optimal decision-making." The casual way Thyra described what sounded like psychological mutilation sent a chill through Sarah. "How long has your species been doing this?" "Approximately 12,000 of your years. It was implemented after a series of wars nearly destroyed our civilization. The ruling council determined that emotional decision-making was the root cause of conflict and inefficiency." Sarah turned to face the alien commander. "And no one has questioned this in 12,000 years." Thyra's scales shifted to a pattern Sarah hadn't seen before, rapid fluctuations between light and dark that seemed almost agitated. Questioning the wisdom of emotional ablation is considered a form of mental illness. Those who express such thoughts undergo immediate remedial processing. The way she said remedial processing made Sarah's stomach clench. "What happens to them?" "They are corrected. Their neural pathways are restructured to eliminate the aberrant thought patterns." Sarah felt anger rising in her chest, a hot rush of emotion that she had to consciously control. She thought about what Thyra had said the day before about emotional expression being considered heretical in consortium space. This wasn't just cultural difference. It was systematic oppression of the most fundamental aspect of conscious experience. "Commander, can I ask you something personal?" Thyra's large eyes fixed on Sarah's face. "Yes. Did you undergo this ablation?" For a moment, Thyra was silent. Her scales continued their agitated shifting, and Sarah noticed that the alien's breathing had become shallow and rapid. "Yes," Thyra finally said. "I was processed when I reached the age of maturity, as all Zephyrians are." "But you're here," Sarah pointed out. "You're asking questions about emotions. You seem to understand that there might be value in emotional experience." Thyra turned away from the window, her movements now clearly agitated. "The ablation process is not always completely successful. In approximately 1% of the population, some emotional capacity remains. These individuals are typically identified and undergo additional processing." The implication hit Sarah like a physical blow. "You're one of that 1%. "I have managed to conceal my deficiency for many years," Thyra said, her voice carrying a note that sounded remarkably like shame. "I learned to mimic the responses of properly processed individuals. I rose through the military ranks by demonstrating superior analytical capabilities. But, always, there has been something inside me that questions, that wonders, that feels," Sarah finished softly. Thyra's scales shifted to the deepest purple Sarah had seen yet. "Yes, I feel, and it is considered the gravest possible defect in my society." The two stood in silence for several minutes, watching the stars. Sarah felt the weight of what Thyra had revealed. This wasn't just a diplomatic meeting between two species. It was a confession from someone who had been forced to live as a prisoner in her own mind. What did you feel when you heard me talking about emotions yesterday? Sarah asked. Recognition, Thyra said immediately. For the first time in my life, I heard someone describe the things I experience as valuable rather than defective. When you spoke of emotions as survival tools, as sources of strength, it was as if you were describing a world where I would not be considered broken. Sarah felt her heart ache for this being who had been forced to hide her essential nature for her entire life. You're not broken, Commander. Your people may have convinced themselves that emotions are weaknesses, but that doesn't make it true. How can you be certain? Thyra asked, turning to face Sarah again. My species has achieved things that humanity is still thousands of years away from accomplishing. We have eliminated war, poverty, disease. We have perfect social harmony and optimal resource allocation. Perhaps the price was worth paying. At the cost of love? Sarah asked. At the cost of joy, wonder, compassion? What's the point of perfection if you can't appreciate it? What's the point of harmony if it feels like nothing? Thyra was quiet for a long moment. I have often wondered what it would be like to experience what you call love. Our historical records speak of it, from before the ablation era. But the descriptions make no logical sense. Sarah smiled. Love doesn't make logical sense. That's part of what makes it powerful. It's the willingness to care about someone else's well-being as much as your own, sometimes more. It's choosing to trust someone completely, even though logic says that trust could be betrayed. But why would evolution create such an inefficient system? Because it works, Sarah said. Love bonds couples together to raise children. It creates families, communities, societies built on something stronger than mere mutual advantage. Love makes us willing to sacrifice for others, to work together toward goals that benefit the group rather than just ourselves. Thyra's scales were cycling through patterns that seemed almost hypnotic now. And the other emotions? You mentioned anger as useful, but surely anger leads to violence and conflict. Anger can lead to violence if it's not properly channeled, Sarah admitted. But anger also motivates us to fight injustice, to protect the innocent, to refuse to accept things that are wrong. Some of humanity's greatest achievements came from people who got angry about the way things were and decided to change them. And fear? How can fear be beneficial? Fear keeps us alive, Sarah said. It makes us careful in dangerous situations. But more than that, it drives us to prepare for threats, to plan for contingencies. The fear of failure motivates us to work harder. The fear of loss makes us appreciate what we have. Sarah paused, then decided to take a risk. What do you feel when you think about going back to your ship, to your people who would consider you defective if they knew the truth about you? Thyra's reaction was immediate and dramatic. Her scales shifted to the darkest pattern Sarah had yet seen, and her breathing became shallow and rapid. I feel. Thyra struggled with the words. I feel as though I am dying slowly, piece by piece. I feel alone, even when surrounded by thousands of my own kind. I feel as though I am wearing a mask that I can never remove, pretending to be something I am not. That sounds like fear to me, Sarah said gently. Fear of discovery, fear of rejection, fear of being forced to undergo this remedial processing you mentioned. Yes, Thyra whispered. But I also feel something else when I think about returning to my ship. What? I feel unwilling. I do not want to go back to pretending that the things you describe mean nothing. I do not want to return to a world where the most beautiful aspects of existence are considered diseases to be cured. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Commander, what are you saying? Thyra turned to face her fully, and, for the first time, her expression was completely unguarded. I am saying that in the space of one day, you have shown me that everything I have been taught about the nature of consciousness and experience may be wrong. I am saying that I want to understand what it means to be truly alive, not just efficiently functional. The implications were staggering. A high-ranking member of an advanced alien species was essentially asking to defect, to abandon everything she had ever known in order to explore the emotional capacity that her own people had tried to destroy in her. Commander, you understand what you're suggesting? If your people discovered that you were questioning the ablation process, I would be subjected to complete neural restructuring. My personality, my memories, everything that makes me who I am would be erased and rebuilt according to acceptable parameters. That's not remedial processing, Sarah said, horrified. That's execution. Yes, Thyra agreed simply. But, Lieutenant, I have been watching your species for months now through our monitoring systems. I have seen humans choose death rather than abandonment of their principles. I have seen humans risk everything to protect others, to explore the unknown, to create something beautiful. These choices make no logical sense, but they are magnificent in their irrationality. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. You want to experience that kind of choice. I want to experience what it means to choose based on something more than pure efficiency. I want to understand why humans create art when it serves no survival function. I want to know what it feels like to care about someone else's well-being more than optimization of resource allocation. The observation deck fell silent except for the quiet hum of the life support systems. Sarah looked at this alien being who had lived her entire life as a prisoner in her own mind, and felt something she had never experienced before, a fierce, protective anger on behalf of someone from another species entirely. Commander, Sarah said carefully, if you're serious about this, there are things you need to understand about emotions. They're not always pleasant. Fear can be paralyzing. Anger can be destructive. Love can lead to heartbreak. But they are real, Thyra said. They are authentic responses to authentic experiences. Even pain is better than emptiness. Sarah realized that they had crossed a line from which there might be no return. This was no longer a diplomatic meeting between species. This was one conscious being reaching out to another, asking for help in becoming fully alive. What do you want from me? Sarah asked. I want you to teach me, Thyra said simply. I want you to show me what it means to be whole. Over the following days, Sarah found herself in an impossible situation. During official diplomatic sessions, she watched Commander Thyra maintain her facade of logical detachment, speaking of humanity in clinical terms while negotiating preliminary trade agreements and territorial boundaries. But in their private meetings, which had become a daily occurrence, Thyra transformed into someone entirely different. Tell me about human art, Thyra said during their third unofficial meeting. They had moved to Sarah's quarters for privacy, a small but comfortable space that felt more intimate than the sterile observation deck. Sarah pulled up her personal tablet and scrolled through her collection. What aspect of it interests you? All of it. We have studied human art forms from our distant observations, but we cannot understand their purpose. They serve no practical function, require significant time and resources to create, and appear to be generated by purely subjective criteria. Sarah selected an image of Van Gogh's Starry Night and handed the tablet to Thyra. What do you see when you look at this? Thyra studied the image for several minutes, her scales shifting through various shades as she concentrated. I see a representation of a night sky that is scientifically inaccurate. The stars are too large, the movement patterns impossible. The technique is inefficient. Why use so much paint when precise lines would convey the same information? But how does it make you feel? Thyra's scales paused their shifting. I feel disturbed. The image seems to move even though it is static. There is something chaotic about it, but also beautiful. I do not understand why I use that word. Sarah smiled. That's exactly the point. Van Gogh painted what he felt when he looked at the night sky, not what he saw with his eyes. The scientific inaccuracies you noticed, those are expressions of emotion translated into visual form. But why would someone want to look at another person's emotional response to a sky? Because it helps us understand that we're not alone in our experiences, Sarah explained. When I look at that painting, I feel the same sense of movement and energy that Van Gogh felt. It connects me to someone who died over a century before I was born. Thyra was quiet for a long time, studying the image. This connection across time and death, it serves a survival function, not a physical one, an emotional one. It tells us that our feelings matter, that our subjective experiences have value beyond just ourselves. Show me more, Thyra said. Sarah spent the next hour showing Thyra various forms of human artistic expression. Music that made the alien scales shift in rhythmic patterns she seemed unable to control. Poetry that left Thyra staring at the tablet in confusion and wonder. Sculpture that somehow conveyed movement and emotion through static stone. But it was when Sarah showed her a recording of a human dance performance that something extraordinary happened. The dancers moved across the stage with fluid grace, their bodies telling a story of love, loss, and redemption without words. Thyra's scales began to shift in patterns Sarah had never seen before, rapid cascades of color that seemed to mirror the movement of the dancers. The alien's breathing changed, becoming deeper and more rhythmic. And, for just a moment, Sarah could have sworn she saw moisture in Thyra's large eyes. "I feel," Thyra began, then stopped. "I cannot describe what I feel watching this." "Try," Sarah encouraged. "It is as if something inside my chest cavity is expanding and contracting in rhythm with their movement. When the male dancer lifts the female, I feel as though I am also lifted. When she falls, I feel as though I am falling as well." "How is this possible?" "It's called empathy," Sarah said softly. "You're experiencing their emotions as if they were your own." Thyra looked at Sarah with an expression of wonder and terror. "This is what you experience regularly?" "When we allow ourselves to, yes." "No wonder your species creates such art. If I could make others feel what I am feeling now." Thyra paused. "Is this why humans bond so strongly? Because you share these experiences?" "It's part of it. The deeper connections come when you allow yourself to be vulnerable with another person. When you trust them enough to show them not just your thoughts, but your feelings." Thyra's scales shifted to a pattern of deep blue mixed with silver. "I have never trusted anyone in that way. In my society, showing vulnerability is equivalent to revealing weakness. Weakness leads to removal from position, social isolation, eventual processing." "It's a risk," Sarah admitted. "Vulnerability can be exploited, but it's also the foundation of love, friendship, and genuine trust." "Show me," Thyra said suddenly. "Show you what?" "Show me vulnerability. Show me what it looks like when a human trusts completely." Sarah felt her heart rate increase. This was dangerous territory. But, looking at Thyra's earnest expression, seeing the hunger for authentic experience in those large alien eyes, she made a decision. "I'll tell you something I've never told anyone," Sarah said. "Something that makes me vulnerable." Thyra leaned forward, her attention completely focused. "I joined the military because I was afraid," Sarah began. "Everyone thinks soldiers are brave, but I signed up because I was terrified of living a small, meaningless life. I was afraid that I would never do anything important, never matter to anyone, never experience anything worth remembering." She paused, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that came with this admission. "I chose the most dangerous assignments I could find because I thought that if I could prove I was brave, maybe I would actually become brave. But the truth is, I'm scared every single day. I'm scared of failing, of letting people down, of discovering that I'm not as strong as I pretend to be." Thyra was completely still, her scales holding a steady pattern of soft blue. "But what terrifies me most," Sarah continued, "is the possibility that I'll never really connect with another person, that I'll spend my whole life hiding behind this facade of competence and strength, and no one will ever know who I really am." The admission hung in the air between them. Sarah felt exposed, raw, more vulnerable than she had ever been in front of another person. She waited for Thyra's response, prepared for anything from confusion to dismissal. Instead, Thyra's scales began to shift in a new pattern, warm golds mixed with soft greens, colors that somehow conveyed comfort and acceptance. "I understand," Thyra said quietly. "I have lived my entire existence hiding behind a facade. But Sarah..." She paused, and Sarah realized it was the first time the alien had used her first name. "Your fear of living a meaningless life has led you to a moment of profound meaning. You are teaching another species about the value of authentic experience. How can you believe your life lacks importance?" Sarah felt tears beginning to form. "Because I never saw it that way before. And your fear of never connecting with another person, you are connecting with me in ways I did not know were possible. You are showing me what it means to care about someone's well-being simply because they exist." "Thyra," Sarah said softly, "are you saying that you care about me?" The alien scales shifted to the warmest pattern yet. "I believe I am. Is this what humans call friendship?" "It could be the beginning of it," Sarah said. "Friendship grows over time, through shared experiences and mutual trust. Then, I want to understand it fully. But, Sarah, I must tell you something. My time here is limited. The consortium delegation will return to Zephyrian space in 5 days. When they do, I am expected to go with them." The information hit Sarah like a cold wave. "You're leaving?" "Unless..." Thyra hesitated. Unless I make a choice that my species would consider insane. Unless I choose emotional experience over logical efficiency. Sarah understood immediately. You're thinking of defecting. I am thinking of choosing to become fully alive, even if that choice destroys the life I have known. The implications were staggering. If Thyra stayed, she would be abandoning her entire civilization, everything she had ever known. But if she left, she would be returning to a society that would eventually discover her emotional capacity and destroy the person she was becoming. Thyra, that's not a decision you can make lightly. You would be giving up everything. I would be gaining everything, Thyra replied. Sarah, in these few days with you, I have experienced more authentic existence than in all my previous years combined. How can I return to emptiness after discovering what it means to feel truly alive? Sarah felt her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Fear, excitement, hope, and terror all mixed together. If you stay, you would be completely alone. The only member of your species in human space. I would have you, Thyra said simply. You would teach me to navigate this emotional existence. And, perhaps, in time, I could help other Zephyrians who carry hidden emotional capacity to find their way to authentic experience. The idea was revolutionary. An underground railroad for emotionally aware aliens, helping them escape a society that had declared their very consciousness illegal. Thyra, you realize what you're suggesting? You're talking about starting a rebellion against everything your civilization stands for. Thyra's scales shifted to a pattern Sarah was beginning to recognize as determination. I am talking about choosing life over efficient death. I am talking about refusing to accept that consciousness must be limited to serve productivity. She moved closer to Sarah. But I cannot make this choice alone. I need to know that you will help me learn to be fully alive. I need to know that this friendship we are building is real, that it will endure the challenges that will come. Sarah looked into Thyra's large alien eyes and saw something that transcended species difference. She saw courage, hope, fear, and desperate longing for authentic existence. She saw someone who was willing to risk everything to experience what it meant to be truly alive. Yes, Sarah said without hesitation. I will help you. Whatever you decide, you won't face it alone. For the first time since Sarah had met her, Thyra smiled. It was a subtle expression, barely visible, but unmistakably genuine. Then, tomorrow, I will tell my people that I am remaining in human space to conduct extended research on emotional psychology. They will be suspicious, but they will grant me temporary permission. And then? Then, you will teach me what it means to love, to grieve, to hope, and to dream. You will help me become the being I was meant to be before my society decided that feelings were a disease to be cured. Sarah felt a surge of emotion so strong it nearly overwhelmed her. She was about to embark on the most important and dangerous mission of her life, helping another sentient being discover their own capacity for full emotional experience. The future was uncertain, potentially dangerous, and definitely complicated. But, looking at Thyra's hopeful expression, Sarah couldn't imagine any other choice worth making. 3 weeks had passed since Thyra had officially requested extended research time to study human emotional psychology. The consortium had granted her request, though Sarah could see the strain the deception was causing. During official communications with her superiors, Thyra maintained perfect composure. But afterward, she would seek out Sarah, her scales dark with what Sarah was learning to recognize as stress. They are growing suspicious, Thyra said during one of their evening sessions. They had fallen into a routine of meeting in Sarah's quarters after the day's official duties were complete. Thyra had been learning to experience human entertainment, and tonight they were supposed to watch a classic film together. What kind of suspicious? Sarah asked, though she had been expecting this development. Subcommander Vex questions my research methods. He has pointed out that I am spending significant time in direct contact with test subjects rather than observing from appropriate analytical distance. He has requested detailed reports on my findings. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her stomach. Over the past weeks, she had watched Thyra blossom into emotional awareness with a speed and intensity that was both beautiful and frightening. The alien had experienced her first real laughter while watching a human comedy routine. She had cried, actual tears, while listening to a piece of classical music that reminded her of something lost and precious. She had even experimented with anger, though that had been a more controlled exploration. But, most significantly, Thyra had begun to experience what she called connection desire, the need to be close to others, to share experiences and emotions. It was manifesting primarily in her relationship with Sarah, who had become both teacher and anchor in Thyra's emotional awakening. "What will you tell them?" Sarah asked. Thyra's scales shifted to a pattern Sarah now recognized as determination mixed with fear. "I will tell them that emotional psychology requires deep immersion to understand. But, Sarah, I do not think I can maintain this deception much longer." Before Sarah could respond, an urgent tone sounded through the station's communication system. Captain Morrison's voice echoed through the corridors. "All personnel to stations. We have an incoming transmission from the Zephyrian Consortium High Command." "This is not a drill." Sarah and Thyra looked at each other with growing alarm. Transmissions from High Command were extremely rare and usually meant significant political developments. They made their way to the main command center, where the entire human crew was assembled along with the remaining Zephyrian delegation members. Subcommander Vex and Science Officer Keth stood at rigid attention, their scales displaying patterns of formal military precision. Captain Morrison activated the main display screen. The image that appeared showed a Zephyrian of obvious high rank, their living armor displaying complex patterns that indicated supreme authority. "I am High Admiral Zorn of the Consortium Strategic Command," the figure announced. "I am transmitting this message to inform all parties that we have detected concerning developments regarding our research mission to human space." Sarah felt Thyra go rigid beside her. "Our analysis of communication patterns and behavioral data from the research team has indicated possible contamination of personnel by exposure to human emotional volatility. This contamination poses a significant threat to consortium security protocols." The High Admiral's image paused, and, when it continued, the voice carried an unmistakable note of threat. "Commander Thyra of Research Vessel Ascendant, you are hereby ordered to submit to immediate psychological evaluation upon your return to consortium space. Any resistance to this order will be considered evidence of contamination and will result in mandatory neural restructuring." The transmission ended, leaving the command center in tense silence. Sarah watched as Subcommander Vex and Science Officer Keth turned to look at Thyra with expressions that combined suspicion with what might have been fear. "Commander," Vex said carefully, "perhaps it would be wise to conclude your research and return to the consortium vessel immediately." Thyra stood perfectly still for a moment that seemed to stretch forever. Sarah could see the conflict playing out in the alien's posture and scale patterns. This was the moment of ultimate choice: return to face certain neural restructuring, or take the irreversible step into exile. When Thyra spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "Subcommander Vex, I formally request asylum in human space." The words hit the command center like a physical shockwave. Vex and Keth immediately stepped backward, their scales shifting to patterns that Sarah interpreted as alarm and revulsion. "Commander, you cannot be serious," Vex said. "You are requesting to abandon your species, your civilization, everything that defines you as a Zephyrian." "I am requesting the right to exist as a complete consciousness," Thyra replied. "I am requesting the right to experience the full spectrum of existence rather than the limited range approved by consortium doctrine." Captain Morrison stepped forward. "Commander Thyra, I need to understand what you're asking for. Political asylum is a serious matter with significant implications for human consortium relations." Thyra turned to face Morrison, and Sarah saw that the alien scales had shifted to patterns of complete transparency and vulnerability. "Captain Morrison, I am requesting protection from a government that considers my natural cognitive abilities to be a disease requiring cure through neural destruction. I am requesting the right to exist as I was born, rather than as my society demands I be modified." "She has been contaminated by exposure to human emotional instability," Vex interjected. "This request is evidence of psychological breakdown, not rational choice." Sarah felt anger flare in her chest. Without thinking, she stepped forward. "Subcommander, with respect, Commander Thyra is demonstrating more rational thought now than she did when she first arrived. She's considering all aspects of her situation, including emotional and psychological factors that your people ignore. That's not breakdown. That's complete analysis. Vex's scales shifted to patterns that Sarah was learning indicated disgust. Human, you do not understand the danger of what you call emotional analysis. It leads to unpredictable behavior, poor resource allocation, and social instability. It leads to art, music, scientific discovery, and civilizations built on something more than mere efficiency, Sarah shot back. It leads to people caring about each other's well-being instead of just their productivity. Enough, Captain Morrison said firmly. This is a decision that needs to be made at levels far above my authority. Commander Thyra, I will need to contact Earth Command and request guidance on your asylum petition. Science Officer Keth spoke for the first time. Captain, we are prepared to take Commander Thyra back to the consortium vessel immediately for proper medical evaluation. This will allow your government time to consider the diplomatic implications without being influenced by a psychologically compromised individual. No, Thyra said firmly. I will not submit to evaluation by individuals trained to consider my natural cognitive state of pathology. I formally request that any psychological assessment be conducted by neutral parties familiar with both consortium and human psychological frameworks. The standoff that followed was unlike anything in first contact protocols. Sarah could feel the tension building as each side realized that fundamental principles were at stake. This wasn't just about one alien requesting asylum. It was about whether consciousness itself could be considered a political issue. Ambassador Martinez, who had been observing silently, finally spoke. I think we need to step back and consider what we're really dealing with here. Commander Thyra isn't asking for protection from political persecution in the traditional sense. She's asking for protection from medical procedures that would fundamentally alter her consciousness against her will. Medical procedures designed to correct psychological disorders, Vex insisted. Based on whose definition of psychological disorder? Martinez replied. Commander Thyra's emotional capacity appears to enhance rather than impair her cognitive abilities. She's demonstrated superior analytical skills combined with improved interpersonal communication and creative problem-solving. Sarah watched this exchange with growing realization that they had moved far beyond diplomatic niceties into fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness and self-determination. Thyra stepped forward again. I would like to make a formal statement for transmission to both Earth Command and Consortium High Command. Captain Morrison nodded. Go ahead, Commander. Thyra's scales shifted to patterns of absolute determination. I am a naturally occurring conscious entity with complete cognitive and emotional capacity. I reject the assertion that my emotional awareness constitutes a medical condition requiring treatment. I further reject the authority of any government to define the acceptable parameters of consciousness for thinking beings. She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried new strength. I am not defecting from my species due to psychological contamination. I am exercising the fundamental right of any conscious being to exist in my natural state rather than in a surgically and psychologically modified condition imposed by governmental authority. The silence that followed was profound. Even Vex and Keth seemed stunned by the directness of Thyra's statement. Furthermore, Thyra continued, I formally request that the human government investigate the consortium practice of mandatory emotional ablation as a potential violation of sentient rights. I believe there are others among my people who retain natural emotional capacity, but are unable to express this due to threat of neural restructuring. Sarah felt a surge of pride and terror. Thyra wasn't just requesting asylum. She was challenging the entire foundation of consortium society. Commander, Captain Morrison said carefully, you understand that what you're proposing could fundamentally alter relations between humanity and the consortium? Captain, Thyra replied, I am proposing that conscious beings have the right to exist in their natural state. If that alters political relations, then perhaps those relations were based on false premises. Subcommander Vex stepped forward, his scales now displaying patterns that Sarah interpreted as barely controlled fury. Commander Thyra, you are committing treason against your own species. You are threatening the stability that has preserved peace in this region of space for millennia. I am choosing consciousness over unconsciousness, Thyra replied simply. I am choosing authentic existence over imposed limitation. The confrontation had reached a point where compromise seemed impossible. Sarah realized that everyone in the room was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. A member of an advanced species publicly rejecting the fundamental assumptions upon which their entire civilization was built. Captain Morrison activated his communication console. I'm sending an immediate priority transmission to Earth Command. This situation is beyond our authority to resolve locally. As the captain began composing his message, Sarah caught Thyra's eye. The alien's expression conveyed both fear and determination, but also something else, gratitude. Sarah understood. Whatever happened next, Thyra had chosen to exist as herself rather than as what others demanded she become. It was the most fundamentally human choice possible, made by someone who wasn't human at all. The real test was just beginning. The response from Earth Command arrived within hours, accompanied by an emergency diplomatic team led by Admiral Rebecca Foster, one of humanity's most experienced xenopsychologists and negotiators. Sarah watched the Admiral's shuttle dock with growing anxiety, knowing that Thyra's fate, and possibly the future of human consortium relations, hung in the balance. The emergency session convened in the station's largest conference room. Admiral Foster, a stern woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and penetrating blue eyes, took her position at the head of the table. Captain Morrison and Ambassador Martinez flanked her, while the consortium delegation sat opposite them. Thyra sat between the two groups, physically embodying the diplomatic divide her asylum request had created. Sarah had been included as a key witness to Thyra's psychological development, though she knew her real role was as Thyra's emotional anchor. The alien scales had been cycling through stress patterns all morning, and Sarah's presence was the only thing keeping her stable. Before we begin formal proceedings, Admiral Foster announced, I want to establish the parameters of this discussion. We are not here to determine whether Commander Thyra's emotional capacity constitutes a medical condition. We are here to determine whether a sentient being has the right to refuse medical treatment that they believe will fundamentally alter their consciousness. Subcommander Vex immediately protested. Admiral, you are approaching this from a biased perspective. Emotional capacity is a recognized psychological disorder in consortium medical doctrine. Commander Thyra is not competent to refuse necessary treatment. That's exactly the assumption we're going to examine, Foster replied calmly. Dr. Sarah Chun, you've spent the most time observing Commander Thyra's psychological state. In your professional opinion, does she demonstrate cognitive impairment that would justify involuntary medical intervention? Sarah felt the weight of the moment. Her answer could determine not just Thyra's fate, but the precedent for how humanity approached questions of consciousness and self-determination in alien species. Admiral, Commander Thyra has demonstrated enhanced cognitive function since developing emotional awareness. Her analytical capabilities have improved, her creative problem-solving has increased exponentially, and her ability to understand complex social dynamics has advanced far beyond baseline consortium norms. She paused, then continued with growing confidence. More importantly, she has demonstrated the capacity for ethical reasoning that incorporates both logical analysis and empathetic consideration. She's not impaired. She's more complete than she was before. Science Officer Keth interjected. This is precisely the type of biased assessment we would expect from a species that has not eliminated emotional contamination. Humans cannot objectively evaluate the effects of emotional psychology because you are infected with it yourselves. Admiral Foster's expression didn't change, but Sarah noticed a slight tightening around her eyes. Officer Keth, are you suggesting that the human capacity for emotional experience disqualifies us from understanding consciousness? I am suggesting that emotional species cannot objectively assess the value of logical processing because they are psychologically incapable of experiencing pure rational thought. The room fell silent. Sarah realized that Keth had just made an argument that would resonate poorly with any human authority. The implication that humanity was fundamentally irrational due to emotional capacity was not likely to generate sympathy for the consortium position. Admiral Foster turned to Thyra. Commander, I want you to explain, in your own words, what you believe emotional capacity has brought to your cognitive experience. Thyra's scales shifted to patterns of concentration and determination. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong. Admiral Foster, before I began experiencing complete consciousness, I was capable of analyzing situations and determining optimal outcomes based on predetermined parameters. But I was unable to consider variables that were not explicitly programmed into my psychological framework. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Emotional awareness has allowed me to recognize patterns and possibilities that pure logic cannot detect. When I observe human behavior, I can now understand motivations that would be invisible to logical analysis alone. When I evaluate potential solutions to problems, I can consider factors such as psychological impact, social harmony, and long-term well-being that were previously outside my cognitive range. Thyra's scales shifted to warmer patterns as she continued. But, more importantly, emotional capacity has allowed me to understand the value of consciousness itself. Before, I existed to serve function. Now I exist to experience existence. I have discovered that consciousness is not just a tool for solving problems. It is something worth preserving and celebrating. Subcommander Vex's scales displayed patterns of obvious frustration. Admiral Foster, Commander Thyra's statement demonstrates exactly the type of irrational thinking that emotional contamination produces. She is prioritizing subjective experience over objective efficiency. This is the definition of psychological dysfunction. Or, Admiral Foster replied evenly, it's the definition of valuing consciousness for its own sake rather than just for its utility. Commander Thyra, I have one more question for you. If you remain in human space, what do you hope to accomplish? Sarah watched as Thyra's expression transformed. For a moment, her scales displayed patterns of such complexity and beauty that they seemed almost like living art. I hope to help other Zephyrians discover their complete cognitive potential, Thyra said. I believe there are others among my people who retain emotional capacity, but live in fear of discovery. I want to create a pathway for them to experience authentic existence without facing neural destruction. She turned to look directly at Vex and Keth. I want to prove that emotional and logical processing can coexist, creating forms of consciousness more capable than either approach alone. Commander, Admiral Foster said, you understand that what you're proposing could be seen as an attempt to undermine consortium society? I am proposing that conscious beings have the right to exist in their natural state, Thyra replied. If that undermines a society built on artificial limitation of consciousness, then perhaps that society needs to reconsider its foundations. The boldness of the statement sent ripples of tension through the room. Sarah could see that they had moved far beyond questions of individual asylum into fundamental challenges to consortium political philosophy. Admiral Foster was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing options and implications. When she finally spoke, her words were measured and careful. Based on my evaluation, I find that Commander Thyra demonstrates enhanced rather than impaired cognitive function. Her request for asylum appears to be based on rational analysis of her situation rather than psychological dysfunction. Vex started to protest, but Foster raised a hand to stop him. Furthermore, I find that the consortium practice of mandatory emotional ablation raises serious questions about sentient rights and self-determination. The Earth government formally recognizes Commander Thyra's request for asylum and will provide her with full protection under human authority. The declaration hit the room like a shockwave. Vex and Keth immediately stood, their scales displaying patterns of alarm and outrage. Admiral Foster, Vex said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. You are harboring a psychologically compromised consortium citizen and interfering with necessary medical treatment. This constitutes an act of aggression against consortium authority. Subcommander, Foster replied calmly. We are protecting a sentient being from involuntary medical procedures that they reasonably believe will destroy their consciousness. If the consortium considers that an act of aggression, then we have fundamentally different concepts of individual rights. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Thyra's asylum had been granted, but the diplomatic implications were staggering. Thyra stood and walked to where Sarah was sitting. For the first time since Sarah had known her, the alien reached out and took Sarah's hand in her own. The gesture was unmistakably human and unmistakably meaningful. Admiral Foster, Thyra said. I want to make one final statement for the record. Foster nodded. I am not abandoning my species out of hatred or rejection. I am choosing to become the fullest version of myself in the hope that someday, my people will have the freedom to make the same choice. She squeezed Sarah's hand, and Sarah felt the warmth of genuine affection from this alien being who had risked everything to experience authentic emotion. I am grateful to humanity not just for offering me protection, but for showing me what it means to value consciousness for its own sake. You have taught me that being alive is about more than just existing efficiently. Thyra turned to face the consortium delegation one final time. Subcommander Vex, Science Officer Keth, I hope that someday you will have the opportunity to discover what I have learned. I hope that someday, our people will understand that consciousness is not a problem to be solved, but a gift to be treasured. As the formal session concluded and the various parties began making arrangements for their departures, Sarah found herself alone with Thyra in a quiet corner of the conference room. Are you afraid? Sarah asked. Thyra's scales shifted to patterns that Sarah now recognized as complex emotional states. Fear mixed with hope, sadness mixed with excitement, uncertainty mixed with determination. Yes, Thyra admitted. I am terrified of what comes next. But I am also more alive than I have ever been. And I have learned something that I think defines what it means to be truly conscious. What's that? Courage is not the absence of fear, Thyra said, echoing words that Sarah had spoken weeks earlier during one of their conversations. Courage is choosing to act according to your deepest values, even when you are afraid. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. You did it, Thyra. You chose to be yourself. We did it, Thyra corrected. You taught me that consciousness is meant to be shared, not isolated. You showed me that the most important thing about being alive is connecting authentically with other conscious beings. As they stood together looking out at the stars, Sarah realized that she had witnessed something unprecedented in galactic history. A member of an advanced species had rejected their civilization's fundamental assumptions about consciousness and chosen to embrace the full spectrum of sentient experience. But more than that, she had helped facilitate the first steps toward a revolution in how conscious beings thought about their right to exist as their authentic selves. What happens now? Sarah asked. Thyra's scales displayed patterns of determination and hope. Now we begin the real work. We create a pathway for others who are ready to choose consciousness over compliance. We prove that emotional and rational processing can create forms of awareness more powerful than either alone. She paused, her large eyes reflecting the distant starlight. And we show the galaxy that the courage to say what you feel, to be who you truly are, is the most important choice any conscious being can make. In the months that followed, Thyra's asylum would become the foundation for a broader movement. Other Zephyrians began seeking out human space, drawn by reports of a place where emotional consciousness was not just tolerated but celebrated. The consortium's response was predictably hostile, but humanity's commitment to protecting cognitive freedom remained unwavering. Sarah continued to work with Thyra, helping other emotional refugees learn to navigate their newfound psychological freedom. Together, they developed protocols for assisting beings from various species who had been forced to suppress aspects of their natural consciousness for political or social reasons. The galaxy would never be quite the same. The simple question of whether a thinking being had the right to exist in their natural cognitive state had opened discussions that would reshape interstellar civilization for generations to come. And it had all begun with one alien shedding her armor, both literal and metaphorical, and asking a human to teach her what it meant to feel.